Oh, well, good morning, fam. I say fam now, so get over it. Let's get you guys offended today. It's Monday. Start the week off right. I have some, depending on the circle, I suppose, some unpopular ideas, and I'll share a few of those this morning and try and provide some justification for what led me to these conclusions. This is not going to be all-encompassing. I haven't written an essay or anything about these things. These are just, like everything else, stream of consciousness, thinking out loud. So the first of these is national service. This is something they do in Israel. You're required, I believe, to do military service or some sort of public service for, it's either 2 years or 4 years. I could be wrong on that. I would appreciate a fact check on that. So what I'm thinking about when I say that I believe national service, conscripted service in the United States is a good idea, I think I've made clear at this point that I'm not a fan of big government. I'm not a fan of blind loyalty to anything or anyone. I'm anticipating a future where most processes have been automated. You can see this happening in grocery stores, department stores, Home Depot, fast food restaurants. Most of the processes that were normally completed by low skill or no skill laborers are being automated, and the automated form of that employee is far more efficient, doesn't have sick days, doesn't complain about work. It's a machine. It can work 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Indeciblia, what's up? So if we're looking at a future where not just menial labor tasks are going to be automated, but more complex tasks, I think long term we could be automating all human endeavors save for creativity. And they've been experimenting with this, trying to get algorithms to, for example, paint in the style of Monet or Van Gogh. And they've been remarkably successful, but they're reproducing something based on previous works. Human beings are unique in their creativity, the creative force, our ability to create something, and our willingness to create something that has no real utility. So you can think of birds that build ornate nests to try and impress a mate. Their purpose is to attract a mate. Their purpose is reproduction. But human beings will engage in creative endeavors for no purpose at all. We'll paint something just to see it a different color. We'll make a sculpture just to have a sculpture there where there was none. So I'm belaboring the point, but if we're going to be automating these processes, and the conversations have already started and the experiments have already started in universal basic income. If you don't know what that is, I'll butcher it real quick for you. Universal basic income is effectively welfare, but for everyone. Every citizen would receive a check, let's say, or a direct deposit every month for base needs. So you would have to estimate based on zip code, what your grocery bill is going to be like, what your electrical bill is going to be like, rent payments, and so forth. This leads to all sorts of other problems, which I'm not going to discuss right now, but at some point, people aren't going to be able to find work, particularly low skill, low IQ, low in conscientiousness people. The boundary for the bottom 20%, it may eventually be the bottom 30%, the bottom 40%, the bottom 50%. People who are not able to produce enough value to warrant a salary that is commensurate with the cost of living for them. So the conversations have already started, and I believe they've already experimented. I want to say it was Sweden experimented with universal basic income, and people just stopped working. They said, oh, well, if I'm going to be paid every month regardless of what I do, if my living expenses are covered, there's no incentive for me to go and work. So people just had sex and fucked around on the internet all day. So they ended that experiment real quick because, as most people said, if you're low in conscientiousness, you don't have an intrinsic motivation. You don't have an intrinsic drive to be productive. If you're going to be paid for doing nothing, you're going to do even more nothing. So, if we are going to have a universal basic income system, let's say, what's up, Paul? If we're going to pay people just to be alive, what that is going to require is buy-in from the people who are productive, the people who will be taxed to provide those payments to people who are unable to find work. Again, this is far more complex than I'm making it. How do you decide who can work, who can't work? How do you reform the entitlement system? How do you get rid of welfare and food stamps and all of those other things and replace it with UBI? There are plenty of problems associated with this. But I think the primary problem from my perspective is the prospect of class warfare. And that is going to come as there is increased dissent among the taxable portion of the population who is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, to a point where we're taxing only about 5% of the population, and they're artists. We're taxing painters and sculptors and people who make YouTube videos and actors and actresses. We're taxing those people to subsidize the lifestyles of the rest of the country. At some point, they're going to say enough is enough, and they're going to stop working. And when that happens, we starve to death. Or we get into these warring factions where the most violent, the most brutal rise to the top, and we end up looking like certain areas in sub-Saharan Africa, where if you are the most violent, the most aggressive, you rise to the top of the social order and you dominate others. That is the future I'm trying to avoid. Now, as I've said, there are plenty of other problems associated with universal basic income. That's the primary problem I'm driving at when I say that I think conscripted service is not a bad way to go about providing some sort of buy-in, some sort of nationalistic pride, some sort of group adhesion, you can call it, the strong nuclear force that holds protons together. You need a glue that binds society. And we've cast aside religion, we've cast aside what is described as the heteropatriarchy. We've cast aside many of the Judeo-Christian values, let's say, that went into creating Western culture. The abolition of slavery because it doesn't respect the individual, giving women the same rights as men because they're individuals in the same way as men are. All of those things stemmed from the idea that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator, as it was codified, with certain unalienable rights. And what that means is that I don't have to give you any rights. You have them. Just by being a thing, you have rights. So we respect that here, but we are veering away through whatever sort of ideological subversion has been happening over the last 50 or 60 years. People are distancing themselves from those traditional values, and we're seeing the effects play out in society. We're safer than we've ever been, while at the same time people believe that we're more unsafe than we've ever been. We're more prosperous than we've ever been, and at the same time people think poverty is a greater problem than it's ever been. This backward, wrong-think subversion of reality is having a real effect on people. And I think if we ever hope to extend the tribe to the globe, we have to start by extending the tribe to the state boundaries. We have to extend the tribe to national boundaries. We have to extend the tribe to continental boundaries. It's going to have to happen in steps. We can't just collapse all cultures nationwide and have an overarching globalist religion that where we all pray to John McCain and his savior Barack Hussein Obama. We can't just collapse the whole system and tell people, here is your new God, here's the new set of standards, here is objective morality, worship this, worship me, worship the state. It's not going to work. I don't think it should work. I don't think we should ever be worshiping anything. What we do need, though, is to love one another. And something that promotes that is teamwork, a goal, an overarching narrative, something to bind people. And I think national service, and I'm not saying that you should have to join the military. You should have to go and fight for the U.S. military industrial complex as we occupy 120 nations around the world for defense. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, maybe you go and clean up. I was in a youth group when I was younger, and we went and cleaned up vacant lots between housing projects in Chicago, just as something to do. We took a bus to Chicago, and that's what we did for a few days. Is just cleaned up those lots, cut the weeds down, picked up all the trash, etc. Doing work for a nonprofit, doing work for the Peace Corps, doing work for whale watchers, doing work for the Big Brothers Big Sisters program, doing something that ties you to the community, that ties you to other human beings, as opposed to this proactive social activism demanding sort of thing. I'm not really even sure how to describe what's happening, but we're totally dislocated from one another, and somehow that's going to result in unity. I don't see that happening. Maybe that's a straw man, but we need something to bind us. And I think national service is one way to do that. I think I've made that clear. It's an unpopular idea that we should have conscripted service, but I have lots of unpopular ideas. Here's another one. I'm unapologetically pro-life. I don't think abortion should be legal except under the most extreme circumstances. I think the choice to engage in sexual activity carries with it the risk of pregnancy. And I think when we collectivize the cost of those decisions, we remove the incentive not to engage in risky behavior. We increase the likelihood that people are going to contract STDs. We increase the likelihood that people are going to have children outside of marriage. We increase the likelihood that children are going to grow up in fatherless or motherless homes. We increase the likelihood that the body parts of those aborted infants are going to be sold for profit by corporations. We increase the likelihood that their organs are going to be harvested and used in medical research. We increase the likelihood that we are going to depopulate our own population, starting with those highest in IQ and highest in long-term planning ability and highest in conscientiousness, while we are subsidizing an underclass that we are creating. I think there used to be incentive for parents to be involved in their children's lives. One of those primary incentives was to keep aberrant penises away from their daughters and to instill in their sons a sense of responsibility, where if you engage in intercourse, you and your girlfriend, let's say, become pregnant, it is your responsibility to raise that child now. So until you are ready to assume that responsibility, you shouldn't be engaging in sexual activity. I know I sound like, a religious fanatic, I suppose. I'm not religious. I think I've made that clear. But I think the moral standards that we are deviating from are the source of many of the issues we're having in our society. A hands-off, laissez-faire parenting style, because there's no incentive for the parents to lean on their children, I guess, to make appropriate decisions. Because there was a time when, okay, your daughter becomes pregnant, the guy's a deadbeat, he leaves. That responsibility, that burden, that's the wrong word to use, because I don't think that child's a burden. That responsibility now falls to a certain degree on your shoulders as well as parents. You clearly weren't doing enough to dissuade your daughter from taking risks. That risk has resulted in a reward, a child, but the responsibility for caring for that child now falls on your daughter and you. Now, I can go to a Planned Parenthood that's paid for with tax dollars by force, and I can murder that baby and absolve myself of any responsibility. I could even take my daughter to have the abortion performed. I could I don't want to get too graphic. So I understand the arguments that if we make something illegal, we're creating a black market. You get these back alley abortions, etc. That's true. That's true. Those consequences accrue to the individual. And what's interesting, when I speak with people who are collectivists, they care very little for the actual collective, for the future, for society, for culture. Because what we're doing is causing irreparable damage to culture and to society. So the argument is inconsistent. And I understand the argument for if a danger to the mother, if childbirth is going to is likely to result in death, let's say. You could perform a cesarean. So, there are options. Let's say the mother's sexually assaulted and a rape results in pregnancy. That's where I'm not the one who's going to make that call. I would default to life, but I don't think I would be willing to force someone to carry a rape baby to term based on the statistical evidence that is going to be bad for society, for the child, and for the mother. That's a tough one. And I think that's why people default to, well, what if she's raped? Okay, you're talking about 0.1% of abortions. So if you look at that statistically, are we going to say that because 0.1% of the population gets in car accidents, we shouldn't let people drive cars? Because 0.1% of the population shoots themselves, we shouldn't allow people to have guns for self-defense. Because 0.1% of the population eats themselves to death from diabetes, we shouldn't let people consume fast food if they want to. It sounds absurd when you apply it to other things that aren't so emotionally charged as abortion is, as reproductive rights, whatever that means. I don't hear anyone advocating for reproductive rights for fathers. So if I were to get a woman pregnant and she decides to abort that child, I have no say in the matter as a father. I have zero rights as a father. So what does reproductive rights mean? Anyway, that's another unpopular idea. I hope you haven't lost all your respect for me. I just think that principle that human beings are equal and important and have intrinsic value, I don't think that only applies to people we like or people that are convenient or people that serve us in some way. I think it applies to zygotes. I think it applies to what will become a human being if I don't prevent it from becoming a human being. I think it applies to life from the point of conception. And get over it. All right, next one. This is something I read this morning from a friend that I follow on here. Prostitution. Big fan. I'm a proponent, you could say, of the legalization of prostitution. I think having the same protections for sex workers that we have for steel workers, rail workers, fast food workers, employees of private businesses. I think having those same protections for sex workers is a good thing. I think the market for sex work is going to exist no matter what we do. And so why are we preventing people from engaging in consensual sexual behavior just because money is exchanged? And here's something that's interesting. If I have a camera in the room and I make a video and money is exchanged, I can call it a porno and not sex work. So sex work happens, pornography happens, prostitution happens, but it happens in a dangerous environment. If you think pimps are contributing to 401ks or paying for healthcare services for their hoes, if you think that they are providing dental plans, I think you're probably wrong. I can't say that with any certainty because I've not done the research to find out if pimps are offering benefits packages. But I would imagine, and I think in the past, prostitution was primarily run by women. You would have a madam or a dame who ran a brothel, and the women were, their health care services were paid for, their food, room and board was paid for, and I don't know, I don't think Rosebud was paying for girls' apartments who were working for him. I think he was just taking their cash and providing basic necessities for them. But if a sex worker could sue an employer for discrimination, could sue for wrongful termination, could hold an employer accountable, and the employer is the pimp in this situation. If the employee has some recourse, I think that's a net positive. I don't think it's the same as encouraging prostitution. But I don't think that it's consistent with my principles to try and force people not to engage in consensual behavior, because there's no victim there. The victims in that instance arise out of the necessity for sex work, or those who are abused while engaging in sex work. And I think you could eliminate a lot of that abuse by offering a legal means to prostitute. How do they do it in Vegas? Or not Vegas, what's that? There's some ranch south of Vegas somewhere. It's legal prostitution in Nevada. How do they do it without surging crime? How do they do it without rapes and violent attacks and the spread of disease and stuff like that? So there's another thing, disease. You could have girls and prospective clients, or guys and prospective clients, tested. Ensure safety. Ensure that, pregnancy is not going to be possible here. The transmission of disease is not going to be possible here. You have security available. These people have gotten background checks. So you'd have regular clients, like in Japan, where you can go and get a table massage and a hand job. They treat it like it's part of the massage, a stress release. And it's a culturally acceptable thing there. Plus, I mean, where's the gun in that situation? That's sort of a default question for me if I'm trying to decide if something's ethical or something's moral. Where's the gun? Okay, is taxation ethical? No, because there's a gun. If you don't pay your taxes, men with guns will come and take you and put you in a cage. And if you resist that, you will be murdered. Is licensing for barber shops ethical? No, because there's a gun. If you practice barbery without a license, someone is going to fine you. If you don't pay the fine, men with guns will come and take you and put you in a cage. And if you resist being put in a cage, you will be murdered. If there's a gun in the situation, that lets me know it requires force. And if something requires force, it is unethical. All right. I think that's all I got. Unpopular ideas. Prostitution should be legal. Abortion should be illegal. And national service or conscriptive service is a good thing and would be a net positive for society. You guys have a good day. We'll see ya.